Gentlemen.
Welcome to the BlockCrunch podcast, the go-to podcast for investors and builders in crypto. And before we get started, just a reminder for you guys out there, the BlockCrunch podcast is intended for informational purposes only. Neither the host nor its guests are licensed financial advisors, and nothing discussed should be construed as financial advice. Views held by BlockCrunch's guests are their own, and sponsorship messages do not constitute financial advice or endorsement. With that out of the way, let's jump right in. Now, before we get started with today's episode, I've got some great news for you. Now, a lot of you have been asking for how I analyze projects that I bring on the show. That's why I decided to create BlockCrunch VIP to share with you all the heavy research that goes on behind the scenes. Now, every week or so, our team prepares an in-depth research memo with things like sector analysis, technical concepts made simple, in-depth competitor breakdown, and even interactive models, so you can learn about the most important projects before they become important. And our team is putting in hours every week scouring Discord, Twitter, forums, and blogs to help you get an edge in crypto and understand the latest projects and themes at the deepest levels that goes way beyond just an interview. Now, in addition, we'll also host exclusive AMAs with myself to answer any of your questions. So all of these are only available to BlockCrunch VIP subscribers. And the good news is that while our interviews will always be free, the VIP tier costs less than one coffee a day. So head on over to theblockcrunch.com/VIP or click the link in the show notes below to sign up. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the BlockCrunch podcast. Now this is a really interesting episode because with the recent OFAC sanctions on Tornado Cash and subsequent discussion on privacy in crypto, I thought it's a really important time that we bring on board one of the leading privacy projects on the show to unpack that entire can of worms. So Aztec Network, for those of you who are not familiar, is a privacy-first, zero-knowledge roll-up. In other words, they are a layer 2 built on top of Ethereum that allows dApps and its users access to private and cheaper transactions with opt-in auditability for compliance as well, which we'll definitely touch on. Now, since launch, Aztec has helped 75,000 registered users transact over $80 million across 200,000 transactions, all while being 96% cheaper than existing private transfer protocols. Now, at the same time, with OFAC regulations, I'm curious, how does that affect the business of projects like Aztec? And are developers who use privacy toolkits like Aztec safe? And are users safe for interacting with these projects? And most importantly, what is the future for privacy in crypto? So to answer many of these very complicated questions, I'm really excited to have Joe and John from the Aztec team with us today. So guys, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
Thanks for having us, Jason.
Definitely, man. So just to get us started, can you both tell us a little bit about what your respective roles are at Aztec and how long you guys have been working on Aztec together?
Yeah, I can go first. So I've been at Aztec for 4 and a bit years now. So it's been a couple of winters in there. And my role is kind of mostly focused on product and strategy. But at the moment, I'm kind of acting CEO as well. Zach's taking a short break. Yeah, all kind of aspects of how we get to market and build out products using this cool technology.
And I came on as head of growth at Aztec, so taking on all marketing, comms, community, and helping people understand the power of privacy.
Definitely. And speaking of that, I think just to kick us off, I'd love to start with a question that you guys probably get asked 10,000 times every day. So why is privacy important if you are not a criminal? So either of you, feel free to take this.
Yeah, I can take a stab first and then hand over to John. But I think it's important to look at kind of where we've come from. If you look at kind of our financial lives in the Web 2 world, there's levels of privacy that we enjoy and we kind of maybe take for granted. Some of them aren't sufficient, like this whole kind of like the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica scandals, which kind of merge the boundaries of like not having sufficient privacy. But from a financial transaction standpoint, I can't see John's bank account. I can't see what was in his weekly shop. There's just kind of basic prerequisites that we enjoy in our kind of Web 2 off-chain lives. And as we think about Ethereum and public blockchains, we have to give those up in the current status quo. So our belief is that most individuals shouldn't have to do that. And you can have a middle ground where you can enjoy the benefits of kind of privacy in your everyday life without having to broadcast all your activity to the world. John, I think you've got some good analogies about showering, which are always quite funny to share.
Yeah, I think, I mean, privacy is just like a fundamental human right. And I think people say that a lot, but don't really understand like what that means. So I think of it as like the foundation for capitalism or competitive markets. Like imagine if someone could read your brain all the time, like read every thought that you ever had, you'd have no competitive edge. There would be no point in having capitalism, right? And if you think about crypto as this like very economic realist market, it strips away some of the competitiveness and ability to protect IP and a competitive advantage if you give up privacy. And there's like layers to privacy protection as well. Like I think as Joe alluded to, there's like this simple notion of like, okay, well, if privacy is not important, then why don't you let people watch you shower? There's something just like deeply, animalistic, human, uncomfortable about someone seeing everything that you do. So there's just like on a basic level, privacy as discretion is really important. But we also know like privacy as security is really important, right? If everyone knows everything that you're doing, then they can target you, they can attack you using, phishing techniques. And then there's this other notion of privacy as a creative force. We don't really think about it every day, but if you went through your everyday life and you logged like how many of the things that do I do, financial or not, where I expect privacy, and like how would my life change if what I was doing right now were not private? It's nearly everything that you do, right? Everything from like, having a side conversation. How would companies even function in a universe where every single conversation were exposed? Like, unless you're Bridgewater and you truly buy into radical transparency, which is a very, very rare organization, right? Just the lack of privacy changes the nature of the games that we play with each other. So I think it's just far more fundamental than people think. And I think privacy has this label as just like, oh, it's just obfuscation. And you'll need to obfuscate things that are bad. And actually, it just runs much, much deeper than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's so much to unpack there as well. There's obviously cultural elements as well. Like certain societies, they're more used to surveillance and they enjoy the, I guess, protection that comes with a surveillance state. But then there are cultures that are, more anti that. And it's so hard to kind of qualify it. I think even for users within crypto, people always feel really strongly about whether there should be, complete privacy for everything, especially now that we've brought in a lot of mainstream people, for quote unquote mainstream people from like the gaming world or like the art world through NFTs. There are a lot of different ideologies. So I'm curious, like, how do you guys balance that when building Aztec? Like, do you have to, I guess, subscribe to a certain ideology to really use Aztec or to see value in Aztec?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a bit like the internet at the advent of the SSL certificate. It's my mental model. It's not a perfect analogy, but I think having all your network traffic going across the internet is something that was kind of well thought and well won by kind of technologists of the last decade. But even within that, there are kind of let's say an art auction website in the Web 2 world has certain kind of non-private aspects to it, but there's kind of a fundamental layer of kind of base layer that is private and is accepted in the Web 2 model. And for Web 3, our view is that the same thing needs to exist, but at the application level, i.e. maybe the art auction in this kind of analogy, there may be kind of conditional privacy that the app needs to kind of request from its users in order to kind of be compliant. But there's a big distinction between base layer and kind of application level privacy. And at Aztec, we kind of think about designing tools and SDKs to give developers that kind of choice. So users can, a given application can see, okay, to use this application, I need to reveal this information, or I can kind of decide not to use the application. So I think it's that at an application level, and the base layer is private.
Yeah, and I think there's infinite rabbit holes we can go down here, but I would love to get to what Aztec is actually building first, so that our listeners have that context. So I've heard Aztec being described in many different ways. Some people call it a scaling tool, a layer 2. Some people call it a developer toolkit to add privacy to existing dApps, and some people think that it's a consumer-facing mixer, like a Tornado Cash. So what exactly is Aztec? Like, what are you guys building here?
Yeah, I think it's important to maybe look at where we've come from because we're kind of a few of those things. But we started life doing something quite a bit different. We're trying to put corporate debt onto Ethereum and give it a neutral settlement layer in 2017. And we kind of realized to do that, financial privacy would be a key proponent of that system. You can't have trades and portfolios visible to the public. That's not how financial markets work. So we kind of set about waiting for Ethereum to kind of implement various bits of privacy. At the time, there was kind of rumors that Zcash was going to kind of be kind of deployed or at least as a pre-compile on Ethereum. And it ended up never happening basically in 2017. So Zach, our kind of CEO, has kind of also got a particle physics background and started looking into some of these protocols and trying to look at it through the lens of, well, what do we need to kind of exist for us to build this corporate debt kind of trading business? So we approached kind of the problem from that kind of practical standpoint of what needs to exist for these kind of disruptive businesses to kind of take down entrenched Web2 organizations. And that's kind of stayed with us through the journey. So we launched a version 1 of the protocol, which kind of just had confidentiality. Missed the mark because it kind of, you could still see transaction graphs and you could still see what was happening. But then in 2021, we kind of launched kind of the culmination of about 2 years of research, which was the first fully private ZK rollup on Ethereum. That version was kind of a proof of concept of what this technology could do and supported private payments between individuals on the L2 and withdrawals to kind of the L1. So it's kind of a good proof of concept of how you could kind of get privacy, but also significant gas savings through the roll-up construction on Ethereum. And we then took a year to kind of improve that model. And this is where kind of the kind of gateway to DeFi kind of analogy that you hinted at kind of comes in with the launch of Aztec Connect. So we upgraded the system in July of this year to not just support private payments, but now for users who have funds inside Aztec, you can call any smart contract on Ethereum from within inside Aztec, retain privacy of kind of your balances on Aztec, but also get gas savings when you interact with that smart contract through a process called batching. So we can batch together me, you, and John into one batch, and we'll pay a third of the cost of the L1 transaction if we're doing a Uniswap trade. So Aztec Connect is kind of this scalable plus private L2, and the combination of all those tools is our kind of development toolkit we call the Aztec Connect SDKs. So that's kind of the current state of the system. Where we're going is a fully programmable private smart contract system, and this is where our programming language Noir fits into the mix. But I'll pause there for a second and see if John wants to add something.
But no, go right ahead.
Cool. Yeah, so in terms of like kind of the next step in the vision, you can kind of think of Aztec Connect as you said, adding privacy and scalability to existing protocols, like existing public protocols. And what we've really done there is we've made the user private. So we've given the user the ability to hide their balances and hide their kind of activity. The end state of the system is we also kind of want to make the applications private and make those not just limited to what's on Ethereum today. And that's where this really interesting intersection kind of comes about of private state, as we call it. You can start to build zero-knowledge games, kind of developer-defined private programmable programs that are executing against Ethereum. So that's kind of the next stage of the journey. But today, on Ethereum, we support kind of users accessing all of DeFi privately and with about 10 to 30 times gas savings.
So just to synthesize there, because there was a lot to cover. So it sounds like you guys are basically building a layer 2 on top of Ethereum that has privacy built into the very rollup itself. And the first use case you guys did was allowing people to basically transact easily with this completely private manner. And if I recollect correctly, it was called zk.money. And then this second product that you guys have built is then extending this privacy to applications that already exist on Ethereum. So people on this rollup can interact with applications on Ethereum, but with the privacy of this rollup, and that's called Aztec Connect. And then it sounds like the third step is to create a fully programmable language called Noir. So completely kind of building out this entire privacy stack. Is that kind of a correct synthesis of what you guys are trying to achieve?
Yeah, that's really accurate.
Got it. And I'm really curious. So I'm really curious how it works. So I think maybe we can focus on Aztec Connect because that sounds like a really ambitious thing. And to my knowledge, you guys have integrated with existing applications like Aave, Lido, Element, and more. Like, how does it work? How is it possible that I'm on a layer 2, but then I'm using an application on layer 1?
Yeah, I can take the kind of how the cryptography maybe works and how you get the privacy, and then hand over to John for kind of how the DeFi interaction works. But at a high level, to get privacy, you need to run a zero-knowledge proof in your browser. So normally, when you have an Ethereum transaction, you're just signing a message in your wallet or in the browser in the dApp, and you're sending this public transaction payload to an Ethereum node, and that's why everyone can see kind of everything on Ethereum. In a privacy-preserving context, instead of signing this kind of transaction and sending it off to a node, you actually need to create a zero-knowledge proof. So the first step in this process is proving you have some funds in Aztec, and then creating a proof proving how you want to spend those funds, and wrapping that up in a highly efficient zero-knowledge proof, and sending that off to a rollup provider. That's kind of the base functionality of the rollup. So in 2021, it just supported sending funds to other users, and it took us kind of a year to add this functionality to the smart contract on L1 to effectively enable you to send funds to another smart contract on Ethereum. So at that point, a user has this ability to not just transact with users, but transact with smart contracts. And John, maybe it's worth chatting through a bit about the current integrations and how the grants program has kind of bottoms up got some of these bridges written.
Yeah, for sure. So the way the system works is because there's no actual smart contract logic on Aztec. It really is like a VPN, a privacy layer for Ethereum. And so the user sends a transaction to a client. Essentially, we have a client kind of like Geth for Ethereum. And then the client communicates with the rollup contract to say, hey, look, you deposited some funds into our rollup contract on L1, and as your proxy, I'm going to do something with it. And so if you look at the Etherscan of like an Aztec transaction that's aggregated on L1, it looks like, Aztec private rollup interacted with, Aave or Element or Uniswap or Yearn or whatever. And so that's kind of like how you get privacy, where an interaction is happening on layer 1 and it is public, but you don't know who was in that transaction. You don't know what percent of the total quantity was yours, and it's not attributable to anyone. And so the way that the contracts on L1 work is, in order to talk to other layer 1 protocols, there just needs to be a simple bridge interface. We call these Aztec Connect bridge contracts, and the bridge contracts are kind of these like simple 200-line interfaces. Anyone can write them, and they're not complex, and they typically don't carry a whole bunch of logic. They're really just an interface that allows our rollup contract to talk to another layer 1 smart contract or protocol. And so that allows anyone to like pretty quickly integrate an existing layer 1 project. And that means that there's massive benefits here. Number one, you get to keep all of layer 1 liquidity. So we talk a lot, for a while we were talking about layer 2 liquidity fragmentation. And this is the idea of like, okay, if I'm Yearn and there's like a certain amount of TVL, in my vaults, and if I want to redeploy to an L2, well, then some of my users are going to move away from L1 and they're going to bridge up to L2, and then now the liquidity is fragmented. Maybe for Yearn it's not like hyper important, but for something like Uniswap where liquidity depth is really important, fragmentation really becomes a problem. The great thing about Aztec Connect is we're not really taking any liquidity away from layer 1 because there's no smart contracting logic in Aztec itself. In this case, you get to interact with all layer 1 liquidity and layer 1 smart contracts that are battle tested, right? They've been around for years. And the only kind of like smart contract risk you're taking is on this incremental bridge interface, which is so simple and robust. It's like incredibly easy to audit. And, there's just, in our opinion, much, much less risk. And the benefits of staying on layer 1 liquidity and security kind of like far outweigh the risks there. So that's like roughly how it works. And, we've got a couple integrations live already with Element fixed rates. Element is a pretty costly protocol to interact with on layer one. And so the batching benefits of Aztec Connect are really beneficial for Element. We've also got an integration with Curve that'll let you swap ETH to STETH. And we're eventually working on a Curve LP and generalized Curve swap bridge. And we just launched Yearn yesterday, actually, so you get access to the leading DeFi yield aggregator on Ethereum, again with like full privacy and cost savings through transaction batching.
And I really like that analogy that you made, John, about how Aztec is VPN over Ethereum network. You can basically use the exact same apps that you already use every day on layer one, but with this kind of privacy layer. So for a privacy conscious user, it really doesn't make any sense to not use something like Aztec, in my opinion. Now, at the same time, I think you guys mentioned that users have to compute these fraud proofs themselves in their own browsers. So does it require certain technical competency for users to be using Aztec? And does it cost a lot of money to compute these proofs?
No, definitely not. So it's not a fraud proof, it's just a zero knowledge proof. And so the Aztec SDK kind of is this highly optimized piece of software that our cryptography team has kind of produced. And one of the main priorities when developing it is not to make privacy an additional kind of UX burden. It's something you touched on maybe in the intro, but if privacy is kind of opt-in and UX friction, then it kind of tends to the situation where only criminals use it. Whereas if privacy has the same UX as a public transaction, most people, as John said earlier, don't want to be kind of watched in the shower, so they kind of end up opting for the private version. So one of the key kind of requirements of the SDK was to have no UX kind of differentiation for these proofs, and as such, you can construct these proofs in about 3 to about 5 seconds on really new hardware, and on kind of like 1 or 2 year old hardware, it's about 5 to 10 seconds, which if you use ZK Money, the application, you can kind of see the interface, and we think it's at least on par with most normal L1 applications, which was kind of, a really big win for us.
That's such a fascinating point as well, because it seems like one of the main sells for you guys is not just privacy, but the fact that you can batch the transaction costs. So it's not just private, but it's also cheap. So even for people who don't care about privacy, it kind of makes sense to use this. Now, I'm curious to kind of dive deep into that, because I know a common critique of ZK-based solutions is that, it's expensive to compute proofs and so on. So how are you guys able to kind of work around this and seemingly have no UX differentiation between using Aztec and just using, layer one applications?
Yes, I think it's important to look at the two parts where there's kind of an expensive cost. So there's the amount of time it takes to prove a program, which is kind of one of these kind of UX costs. We've managed to kind of get around that by our kind of in-house cryptography team inventing new cryptographic protocols. So Plonk is one of these widely used protocols that the Aztec team invented. That gets us kind of these hyperfast ZK snark constructions that work in the browser. And then the other part of this is actually validating that proof on Ethereum. So if you look at kind of a normal privacy protocol on Ethereum, every user has to validate a zero knowledge proof on Ethereum. And this is actually how the first version of Aztec worked. And kind of gas costs were close to $1 million gas for verifying these transactions. And it was just a huge UX friction. So kind of with the advancements in ZK technology, zero knowledge rollups have been able to be created. And kind of what that does is amortize the verification cost of this proof on Ethereum amongst thousands of users. So in Aztec's case, we have a rollup block, which at the moment has space for 896 transactions. So an Aztec node takes user transactions, which are zero knowledge proofs themselves, aggregates them together into a block of 896 transactions, and creates a proof that the whole block is correct. Then there's only one single proof that's validated on Ethereum, so you get to amortize this expensive L1 verification cost over 896 users, which kind of pretty much makes it trend to zero. The cost of kind of privacy in the current system is around 500 gas for the verification cost, which compared to the base transaction cost on Ethereum is negligible.
Yeah, and I guess just to wrap up on the part about the Aztec product itself, before we dive into some of the more recent developments and implications of regulations, Aztec is definitely not the first privacy-focused project out there. There are projects like Monero, Zcash, Tornado Cash, and newer projects like Manta that are all promising some form of privacy guarantee, usually some form of obfuscation through just mixing you with a lot of other users. So what type of, what are there any differences in terms of privacy guarantees that users can get when they, use ZK money to transact versus using something like Tornado Cash? What are the main differences between these different approaches?
Yeah, I think so. Our privacy is kind of at a cryptographic level is much closer to the Zcash protocol. Actually, our chief scientist Ariel was one of the early kind of Zcash cryptographers. So the privacy guarantees that we get follow this UTXO based model. So you do get stronger privacy guarantees because things don't have to be bucketed into fixed amounts like a mixit is. So in Aztec, you can have UTXOs inside the system, which just represent encrypted value. And they can be $1, $111, arbitrary kind of size. And that creates a stronger privacy set than kind of just a fixed kind of mixing style system. And then, John, maybe it's worth chatting a little bit about kind of how Aztec Connect kind of adds in infinite privacy into the mix.
Yeah, I think the notion of a traditional Tornado Cash 1.0 mixer is that you have to deposit these fixed quantities and then they kind of get obfuscated. The beauty of having a network with like much greater utility than anonymization, so including entering vaults and earning yield and trading, is that it becomes very hard to track there's no transaction graph, so it's really hard to track that like a 1 ETH deposit is ever associated with like a 1 ETH withdrawal, because anything could happen to it in the middle, because you can always go down to Ethereum and you live your life, right? There's the whole point of creating a privacy by default network is that there's like utility far beyond just anonymization. And I think that's probably the path to getting like widespread privacy adoption too, right? If like privacy is like has an extremely, extremely narrow utility, basically just obfuscation, then you can imagine that like there are only a small number of people who prive obfuscation for obfuscation's sake. But if it's just by default that you have privacy and you can pretty much live your life and get privacy for free, both from like a UX perspective and a cost perspective, well then like privacy should shed its bad name, right? Every single person should elect privacy if it's essentially cheap and free. And so that's really the goal of our system is, number one, to like enforce even more transaction graph complexity and honestly stronger privacy guarantees because of all of the real life like useful things that you can do with the system beyond just like mixing.
Hey guys, I'm really excited to tell you more about one of my favorite products in crypto right now, DYDX. This is a team I've known since 2018, and they've built one of the best exchange venues out there that also happens to be decentralized and mobile friendly. Now listen until the end because there's an opportunity for savvy traders out there as well. And here are just a few reasons why I like DYDX over other exchanges. First, it's very liquid. It processes $2 to $3 billion every day in volume and has 35 perpetual swaps as of this recording, which means you can trade things like Ethereum, Bitcoin, Doge, Solana, and most of the most popular assets with up to 20x leverage in the venue today. Now second, it's also extremely cheap, and if you're down bad from the bear market, you don't have to worry about gas fees at all because there is no gas fee on Starkware Layer 2 where DYDX is built on. Now that brings me to my next point as well. It's incredibly fast. Unlike other layer 2 and high-speed DEXs, you don't actually have to wait to withdraw your assets anymore. And as an additional point, by using Starkware, DYDX also provides user with increased security and privacy. And my personal favorite feature is the cross-margin feature, which means I can seed one account with USDC and trade across multiple markets from there without needing to start sub-accounts because I really hate managing so many different sub-accounts. And their iOS mobile app is also live right now, and it's amazing because it's compatible with MetaMask, Coinbase Wallet, Coin98, Huobi Wallet, and a lot of the most popular mobile wallets out there. And it's available for people outside of the US or sanctioned countries today. And one last thing, one exciting opportunity is their competitions. The most recent tier in the $10,000 equity tier have won over $95,000 in rewards. And you can get started with as low as $500 in equity to compete for prizes. So if you're already trading, might as well get paid to do it. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, I highly recommend that you head on over to dydx.exchange to learn more. And I thank them for sponsoring this episode. Yeah, that's such a great point as well. It's kind of like messaging protocols today. I guess some people might think that why do you need end-to-end encryption on your messages? Like, are you messaging like things that you shouldn't be messaging? But now pretty much every single messaging app, maybe except for Telegram, is end-to-end encrypted now. And that's almost a norm. So it makes sense that, to create privacy, once we create privacy as a norm, it won't be as frowned upon. And I think that's a great segue to the huge elephant in the privacy room right now, which is this whole OFAC thing that just happened. So to give our listeners a little context, but I'm sure most people already know this. So recently, OFAC issued a sanction on Tornado Cash. And I guess when it comes to Aztec, I think some users reported that FTX was like blocking addresses or accounts that have sent coins through CK.money, which is your transaction app built on top of Aztec. So to my knowledge, so far there's no official response from FTX, but I think SBF, who is the CEO of FTX, tweeted that they are constantly monitoring transactions for AML compliance, which I assume will hold true for most applications or companies out there as well. So how are you guys thinking about this? Is there a risk that, all the applications just ban users who ever interacted with Aztec?
I think it's definitely a risk of kind of over-compliance, and I think recent kind of clarification from OFAC has kind of shown that this is kind of constantly changing space. I think the kind of in respect to like exchanges, it's about kind of looking at kind of analogies like Zcash, where there have been examples of privacy services that can show withdrawing to that kind of exchange and it being a compliant activity because the user can furnish some sort of transaction proof. I think it's kind of a changing for the whole industry though. So a lot of kind of the effects of these sanctions are still not known, and the effects of kind of the lawsuits are also still not known. But John, I wonder if you've got anything to add around kind of our credibly neutral approach.
Yeah, I think in FTX's case, it's like, they have some requirements to do like risk mitigation, and they actually oftentimes, all the exchanges outsource their risk assessment often to third parties. Crypto people call this like narcware or whatever. And actually, just as a side note, I actually think like this is a call out for crypto people. I think because of the ideals in the space, like, crypto natives don't want to build narcware, and so then the narcware gets built by narcs, right? And then we complain about it, that like it's over compliant and that it's not democratic and it's like not according to like the social crypto consensus. But it's also because like we don't like to build those tools to restrict our own freedoms. And so I think this is one of those things where fairly or not, Aztec gets labeled like, oh, this is a privacy thing, and it gets bucketed with all the other privacy protocols. And it's not really, if you think about it, if I'm a chief compliance officer at a centralized exchange, right? These are not protocols. Like these are basically like regulated banks or, in whatever jurisdiction they're in. Like they have a risk team that's just there not to like stand up for your rights, like not to stand up for like speech or, not to have an opinion on OFAC or like how this affects like, immutable contracts. Like they're really just there to be like, I definitely want to make sure nobody knocks on our door at any given point, right? You just don't want a regulator or a sovereign intelligence agency like OFAC to be like, hey, we suspect like some bad stuff went through. And for whatever reason, I think it's because Tornado, for better or worse, had a significant amount of illicit activity going through it. And so like a credibly neutral technology can still carry a lot of harm on its rails. And like, I think that's a difficult conversation that we need to have. And that's why we're aiming for privacy with utility, because privacy for privacy's sake may just attract like kind of like unsavory users. And so I think like to put a bow on this, all FTX is doing is like trying to cover their ass, right? And so, we can villainize them for that. But like that's what centralized exchanges incentives are. It's up to us as decentralized protocols to like build like robust systems that are credibly neutral. Now, some of the things that we've taken that frankly, for our audience have been deeply unpopular, for our user base have been deeply unpopular, is try to implement what we think are credibly neutral restrictions on use. And by restrictions, I mean like not targeting specific users or geographies or anything like that, but just saying like, we're going to make sure that if somebody hacks $30 million, it's going to be like a real pain for them to like move through the system. Now, is that like a feature restriction? Absolutely. Like if you're a whale that wants to move $100 million through Aztec and like deposit it all in one go, like you can't really do that. It's going to take you a load of time, but that's why we think it's a credibly neutral deterrent. Like, it doesn't stop anyone from doing anything. It just takes people longer. It's just a little bit of friction. Now, we recognize this is unpopular, and it's something that we're working on. And we believe that once we get to a fully decentralized, fully programmable network, we'll have full transaction graph privacy while also having flexible compliance. Like, you'll be able to prove KYC without, revealing your identity. And that'll be fully opt-in. And so we hope to get to that point. But for now, I think our perspective, being one of the only live privacy applications with, utility, with smart contract utility, is we want to keep the system live. It's obviously usable. There are over 100,000 registered users, and we're now past $125 million of volume. There are clearly people around the world who found this valuable, and we're keeping it live and making sure that to the degree we can, we're deterring bad behavior without restricting any individual's ability to use it.
Yeah, I think I'd add, if you look at kind of where the sanctions hit for kind of Tornado Cash, the Ethereum network is fine. There's an example of a network there which the world has judged because it has apps like Uniswap and kind of huge stable coins which are paying kind of people in the US and around the world. That network has not been blacklisted because it overwhelmingly has utility. So I guess our approach here is, incredibly neutral deterrence, but also at every stage building kind of or showcasing utility through the integrations that we're adding. So I think it's a call out to kind of all privacy projects to kind of show real world utility and kind of move this kind of into the adoption phase rather than kind of being theoretical. So our approach here is keep launching bridges. Went out this week, and we have a dollar cost averaging bridge, which I think is like a huge win for users coming out next week or the week after. So if we can keep showing utility, I think we can protect everyone's individual rights to privacy by kind of making it a choice for regulators.
Yeah, and I have definitely a lot of respect for you guys for building this, especially because it's such a difficult line to tread on in terms of how do we build something that's credibly neutral, but at the same time, I'm sure everyone working at Aztec, if someone does some sort of terrorist financing through the network, you guys will want to be at least somehow able to at least make that very difficult to do without compromising on, I guess, the value proposition on the network. So on that, I'd love to touch on that because I think, John, you mentioned that right now, if someone wants to move a vast amount of capital through the network, it's harder. So why is it harder? Are you guys rate limiting or limiting the amount of capital you can move in a day? Or are there other types of compliance built into the network today?
Yeah, so we've had limits on Aztec kind of since we started. They serve a few purposes. One, this is kind of brand new technology that is still being kind of proven out, and we don't want there to be a bug in the cryptography. So we've always had user limits to kind of help safeguard how much a user can put in a given transaction. But those limits also serve kind of as a gating function to stop large amounts of funds being deposited kind of in one go. Most users don't need to deposit 1,000 ETH to the system or 10,000 ETH to the system in a kind of 24-hour period. So most of our kind of deterrents kind of to protect users, but also they have this kind of nice side effect of rate limiting the total amount of kind of capital that any one actor can put in. Obviously, there's ways people can work around them, and they're not perfect. But it's kind of a middle ground we're treading at the moment to try and keep the system live and showcase the utility.
And do you guys think it's possible to build a vision of Aztec in the long term that fits both the needs of regulators, maybe some sort of a backdoor for them, only for regulators, but at the same time preserve privacy to 99.9% of the population out there? Is that a vision that is worth pursuing, or does that compromise on some of the core values you guys have? And how do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't think that's worth pursuing, but there is a kind of alternative vision that kind of, I think, would achieve the same goals and requires programmable privacy. So at the moment, the kind of the programs that you're creating these proofs over to get privacy have been created by us, and they're not programmable, and they're kind of very limited in their functionality. Once you get to the end state of Aztec and you have Noir, you can build in compliance at the circuit level as an application and as a developer. And in that world, there doesn't need to be a backdoor. What you can actually do in the program is prove that by definition you are compliant. So a popular example, I think, is like the travel rule in the US. You have to prove some sort of kind of KYC or AML check if the transaction is above a certain level. So a developer can come along, building on this kind of neutral base layer, and if that application is transacting money, not kind of NFTs or some token, but if it's transacting US dollars, it could prove that the two counterparties in the transaction have done some sort of like KYC check, and the amount is below some sort of threshold, let's say $10,000. And you can do all of that whilst maintaining like ironclad sender and recipient privacy. So by definition, if the transaction happened, it's compliant, which is kind of flipping the whole compliance model on its head, because right now compliance is all retroactive and is done by transaction monitoring and people kind of crawling through data. But I think something we're excited about is engaging with these regulators once the technology is in this kind of slightly more mature state and you can have programmable privacy, to kind of talk about these kind of best of both world scenarios. But it's not via backdoors, it's via kind of better cryptography and kind of stronger privacy guarantees, if anything.
Got it. And John, anything to add there as well?
Yeah, I think I would just add that, like, you know, I think one of the we have to think about what the goals are here. Like, if you look at users on Ethereum, right? You use the 99.9% number. I don't know the exact number, but how many people are onboarded into the Ethereum network through regulated on and off ramps? I would guess it's something like 99.9%. Like, unless you like actually mined your own ETH, or unless you did ETH for cash, which like already makes you question kind of like, okay, these are like mega hardcore, like, you know, you're at really inefficient, really unscalable ways of getting in and out of the network. The vast majority of people are going in and out of regulated exchanges. And so it kind of like begs the question a little bit, like there's a lot of outrage right now about, you know, implementation of some of these flexible and privacy preserving checks. Like, you can imagine like a KYC tree, right? Where you do third party KYC, you attest to the membership in that tree, and nobody knows who you are. They just know that like you're okay, right? And then you get into a system, and then you have full transaction graph privacy. Nobody knows what you do. Nobody knows who you are. Nobody cares like who you interact with. And then when you come out and you attest again to like, hey, I'm like one of the good guys. That's functionally what Zcash does now, right? It's like you functionally get in through an exchange, you have full transaction graph privacy in between, and then you get out by an exchange. And so I think like we need to be a little bit intellectually honest about what the goal is here. Like, are we really trying to serve the type of person who like wants to do cash for ETH? Or are we trying to serve the type of person who's like okay with identifying themselves as a good guy, again, without giving up any of their privacy? Just like, I can attest that I'm a member of like this KYC tree on the ins and outs, and then in between I get all the benefits of privacy, right? I would gather that like the vast majority of people see that as a viable solution. And then for the small number of like mega hardcore like cash for ETH people, I want to hold you to that, right? If you're really the type of person who's like absolutely no KYC ever, then I want to know, like, are you doing ETH for cash? Reasonably speaking, I don't think there's a protocol that could gain, you know, a significant impact for like humanity, right? Like benefit people on a vast scale with transaction graph privacy, who is willing to undertake like adoption of these like unregulated on and off ramps. I think that might be like a little bit controversial to say, and it might like piss off some of the more hardcore people, but like we need to be intellectually honest about like who we're building this for.
Yeah, and I think I was just going to add, if you frame it like that, like the given kind of the nation states in the world, having these backdoors was something that was considered in kind of the early encryption wars, and eventually governments realized they cause more harm than good. So you need to move, like if there's a backdoor, then the kind of access to that backdoor is only as kind of strong as where you lock the key to the backdoor, which we've had elections that have been rigged. We've had all sorts of things that have happened kind of over the last kind of 10, 15 years. So I think if you frame it how John framed it, like having these kind of apps that are built on top of a incredibly neutral base layer means that you can achieve the best of both worlds. You just need the technology to mature maybe 1 year. We're at the cutting edge right now, and Noir is kind of getting ready for the prime time, but this is kind of cutting edge stuff. So yeah, I think it's going to be an exciting year, but it still needs to kind of come out of the Aztec lab and into the real world.
Yeah, and before I move on to that, actually, I did want to touch on that at the end, but I want to double click on that point about the types of users as well. So if we assume, say, like 90% of the people who would want to use privacy software are okay with the type of privacy that they already get right now from exchanges. So for instance, I actually think centralized exchanges are probably the most convenient type of mixer right now. Whenever I send funds, onto an exchange and send them onto, say, a DApp, it's just listed on Etherscan as coming from Binance or coming from FTX. The public doesn't really know who it is. I can do whatever I want, and then I send it back to the exchange. But the exchanges know who it is, so if I ever do anything illicit, they can still report me to the regulators. But it also serves the privacy that I need, which is, I don't care if the exchanges know what I'm doing. I just don't want, all the random public people out there to know what I'm doing. So do you think that is serviceable? Does that already fit the requirement, the need for privacy that most people have, and it kind of, what in addition to that is missing right now?
Yeah, I think it fits it pretty cleanly. I think you can go one important step further, which is kind of conditional access to that data. So if at any point in the Web 2 world you change your mind, you don't have a kind of recourse mechanism other than maybe through GDPR in the EU, getting your data deleted or access kind of being revoked. The great thing about Web3 is that if I decide I don't like service X anymore, I can kind of stop them from seeing my data or future data because I control it. So I think that control of access is another important thing that kind of needs to be thought about intellectually from kind of a user standpoint. And at the moment, we're obviously very far away from that because every time we do a transaction on Ethereum, not everyone is aware that you can see my current and future transaction history. So there's some education to be done, but I think that once that's made kind of common knowledge, the model you suggest will be sufficient for 90% of the population.
There's also, transaction graph privacy. Transaction graph privacy is really useful. That's one thing that I would say. And then the second thing I'd say is under a Noir system where you have a fully programmable smart contracting language, you get private state. And private state is really necessary for really, really basic games. And I mean games in the literal sense, but also kind of like games in the sense of these are all mechanisms for coordination. So if I wanted to play cards with you on chain, Jason, it wouldn't be a really fun game if we could only play the game with our cards face up. And so there is this notion of privacy for discretion and privacy for individual protection, but there's also privacy as a feature, right? And there are no networks that allow you to do flexible private state like that. And the amount of games that you can build as a result is really vast. And so, yeah, centralized exchanges are never going to allow you to build a base layer with that type of programmability in there.
And I think a final point I want to touch on with this whole OFAC stuff before I move on to more exciting developments in Aztec. Now, I think with the recent sanctions, a lot of companies are very concerned, and it's not clear what companies are considered to be potentially in violation. So even staking providers or even Flashbots, who's creating their MEV boost relay, all of them are suddenly thinking, are we responsible for censoring certain transactions? Now, in this case, because in Aztec, it seems like the users are generating the proofs themselves in the browsers, does that mean the users are potentially responsible for, if OFAC sanctions extend to Aztec and not just Tornado Cash, does it mean users might be violating sanctions as well?
I think it's a very nuanced question. I think the one difference between an Aztec node and a kind of Ethereum staker or miner is that, and it's an important distinction, is that Aztec nodes don't attest to correct state. They receive, as you say, a proof of what the correct state should be, and they compress it. So in that model, it looks a bit like an ISP. ISPs receive encrypted packets of data and they compress it, and kind of the world's okay with that after some legal fights. From a user standpoint, then the analogy would be, well, if I'm on a web page and I'm sending an encrypted packet of data, am I liable? If that packet of data is kind of doing something which in your country is illegal, then the chances are you probably are liable, but not for just generally interacting with a tool. It comes down to kind of I think, what the user is actually doing and what the intention is, rather than just a blanket restriction. And that's where we need, as an industry, kind of more regulatory clarity, because at the moment, OFAC's kind of used a bit of a blunt instrument, which has had kind of several consequences for these lawsuits for users in the US who've got funds stuck. And luckily, OFAC's kind of provided some clarification on that and provided a way for users to kind of get their funds back. But I think it's a changing space, and it needs better communication between projects and regulators to make sure this doesn't happen in the future and cause this much confusion.
I think it's worth double clicking on this point of like the proof is generated client side in browser. Like there's no unencrypted data leaving your machine. And that means like actually network level censorship is way harder. So like if you're a rollup provider or like block proposer, right, you're just getting a bunch of like essentially sealed envelopes. And like you don't know what the envelopes contain or what interactions there are or like what users interacting with whom. And so like even if you went to the block proposer and you were like, hey, I need you to like censor everyone who's like doing a certain activity, they'd be like, I can't. Like there's truly just like encrypted packets coming my way, and I'm just like passing them on, I'm packaging them on and proving them on Ethereum. And like I think that's a point that's like not sufficiently discussed, and why are mixers like so eminently censorable, but like base level, privacy, like the way we design is not? It's like, well, because in a mixer you can kind of see everyone coming in and out, and like in a fully programmable private network, the actual network participants themselves, it makes it very, very challenging them for doing things like extracting MEV or reordering transactions or censoring individual transactions, because they just can't. There's no visibility.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think this is a good way to for us to wrap up with the final question here, which is focusing on the grand vision for Aztec. So it sounds like one of the biggest things that you guys are working on is Noir, which will transform Aztec basically into its own infrastructural stack with its own privacy-based, Rust-based privacy programming language. Now, with the climate that we're in right now, with general regulators being extremely sensitive to privacy, and I think a lot of founders out there are pretty spooked. How will you guys scale this? Like, how do you bring this to the world in a way that can excite developers again?
Yeah, I think it's something that John alluded to earlier for Noir specifically, but gaming is something which can be a bit more light touch than some of the current news headlines. So one of the things we're excited about in the coming weeks is at the DevCon hackathon, we'll have both Aztec Connect available for people to hack with and build out clear cases which are utility only for private DeFi. But we'll also, for the first time, have a version of Noir which runs in the browser, and you can start to build fun games with that, like Wordle and Battle Zips, which is a previous hackathon winner, or Hangman. And if you look at those applications, there's no way you can launder money playing Hangman. So it's it's something that I think can help at least bring the developers back and show other sides to this technology that are not just financial. So that's our approach, I think. And I think you just keep building. All of this will sort itself out eventually.
Yeah, I'd maybe add that, when it comes to OFAC and being spooked, I think there also needs to be education and clarification. It's like OFAC is an intelligence agency. They're like the CIA, except instead of weapons and the Department of Defense and SEAL Team 6, they have these economic weapons. And so I think people are looking at this oh no, regulators hate privacy. It's like OFAC's not a regulator. You got the definition wrong. OFAC is an intelligence agency. And so that doesn't mean that it's not a challenge we have to get through, but I think universally the regulators have been pretty amenable to privacy. The fact that Zcash exists, the fact that Zcash is integrated on exchanges, the fact that Biden's executive order mentioned consumer privacy 10 times, we're still extremely bullish privacy. We wouldn't be working here if we didn't believe in the importance and universality of privacy. And so OFAC it needs to be treated the way it is, which is an intelligence agency's direct attack on another sovereign that threatens the United States foreign policy goals. But it shouldn't be seen as more than that. And so, we're really excited to continue to build new technology, of course, that expands utility. And, we want to get to a point where privacy is the default. And we know as a society that when privacy is the default, we are actually able to tolerate crime going through private rails. for instance, like email, right? It's like we're tolerating like crime going through email. We're tolerating crime going through Signal. Why? Because we think the benefit to society as a whole far outweighs like the tiny minuscule proportion of activity that goes through the same systems. So that's our goal. Like, and I think some of these advancements with Noir and the $20,000 we're giving away at ETH Bogota is hopefully a step to proving that, where people are going to be able to build things with extreme amounts of utility that are far beyond just obfuscation.
And boom, that's a mic drop. I love that. That is amazing. And I'm really excited to keep up to date with what you guys are working on. And I'm sure a lot of users and listeners want to check out what applications maybe they can play around with and what you guys are building as well. So what are the best channels for them to reach out or follow you guys?
Yeah, our Twitter is twitter.com/Aztec Network, and our Discord is discord.gg/Aztec. And those are the two best places to find us. And as a reminder, we are going to ETH Bogota, and we're the presenting sponsors for that hackathon, and we're bringing $20,000 in prizes for people to build on top of Aztec Connect, the VPN for Ethereum, and Noir, the flexible smart contract, private smart contracting language.
Absolutely. And I will put those in the show notes below. So once again, Joe, John, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a much needed episode in this very, very weird time that we're in. So really appreciate you guys coming on.
Appreciate you, Jason.
Questions.
Awesome. I think we...
All right, that's it for this week's episode of the Blockcrunch podcast. So thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to subscribe on your favorite apps. And in case you didn't know, this interview is also available as a video on YouTube. And if you tag the Blockcrunch on Twitter this week and tell us what you liked about this episode, I'll be sure to respond to you as well. Now, if you'd like to go even deeper, we have a VIP tier where every week or so, we write an in-depth research brief or investment memo on a project. And we'll have exclusive AMAs with myself where I answer all your questions as well. Now, we already have analysts from some of the top funds and companies in crypto as subscribers. So if you're serious about getting an edge in crypto, head on over to theblockcrunch.com/VIP to learn more. And once again, thanks for supporting the show, and I'll see you next week.